Friends, very good to have you with us. Nice to see you. James, nice to see you too.
Nice to see you too, Ian. Yeah. And this early Christmas season.
Indeed. Yes, it is. It's video 129.
Yeah. Which
I'm not sure I know anything very interesting about 129 other than it's 3 times 43. So it's not a prime number, but it's a product of 2 primes.
Yeah. Well, indeed. It's the sum of the first 10 prime numbers.
Okay.
But, that's interesting, isn't it? If you're a mathematician.
And Psalm 129 is one of those slightly odd ones. It's about being persecuted and they held my back and all that kind of thing. So
it's pretty grim, really. Grim stuff.
Well, friends, if you know anything interesting about 129, do put it in the comments below.
Yeah.
So it's one of the 4 things we love you to do. James, where are we in the lectionary?
Right, we're on the first Sunday of Christmas,
which means that up till now it hasn't been Christmas. It's been Advent, hasn't it? So that means I'm sure nobody has had Christmas carol services. You've had Advent carol services.
Exactly.
Now you can have Christmas carol services.
Yep. So you can start getting those Christmas carols out and all that sort of thing.
You can put your Christmas tree up.
Yeah, you can put your Christmas tree up and start enjoying the 12 days of Christmas and all that. Yeah.
Good. And what's our passage?
It's Luke 2 and 41 to 52. So this is it's an extraordinary story, unique to Luke, the only story we have from Jesus' childhood, the story of Jesus in the temple, getting left behind, etc.
Getting left behind. That's an interesting
phrase.
Yes. Yeah. We've in the lectionary terms, we've jumped over the circumcision, haven't we?
We have, and we're
going to come back to that in the lectionary.
Yes, we are on January the whatever, and of course we've jumped over also Simeon and Anna, which we come back to at Candlemas in February.
Yeah.
So it's it's interesting. We've gone from the sort of baby Jesus on Christmas Day to the 12-year-old on just a few days later on Christmas 1. So I mean, perhaps people might strike people on Christmas 1 as a slightly unusual place to be, but
is this the Sunday we call Low Sunday? Not really.
No, Low Sunday is really the Sunday after Easter, although I think a lot of people regard the Sunday after Christmas as quite low because a lot of people are away and that sort of thing.
So we'll see what the uptakes
are off
from the video. Right. They might want the video though because people might want to have a quick shortcut to preparation.
It could be possible on the Saturday night perhaps after enjoying Christmas.
Before we plunge into the passage, one quick word on commentaries. I've done what I quite often do is I've been making use of Michael Parsons. If I can get this in focus, not very easily.
Mm-hmm.
No, it doesn't want to get focusing on my face. This is Michael Parsons' Paideia commentary. I usually get it to... There we go.
Yeah, you had to put it in front of your face.
And of course, the hefty NIC commentary by Joel Green.
Yeah.
Joel and Michael, if you're watching, thank you very much indeed. But you've been looking at a couple of other commentaries, haven't you?
Yeah, I've been looking at this Teach the Text commentary, which is Dick France on Luke, which this style of commentary can be very helpful for people. They're not too detailed at all, and they give suggestions on preaching. And the other, which I think we've mentioned before also, According to Luke by David Gooding. He's very, very good and got some very insightful things to say, and in a sort of non-commentary style, slightly more general style, but does go through passage by passage.
And worth saying, folks, that if you are getting commentaries, don't just buy 1, buy 2 or 3. It's great to have a selection and buy ones of different length because the longer ones will get into some of the textual details and controversies more convincingly.
Yeah.
Although I have to say that with Michael Parsons, he's really interesting because as a Paideia commentary, it's quite short, but he packs an awful lot in. So he gets a lot of information.
He's very economic with his words.
Yeah, he is indeed.
Yeah.
So here's our passage. Now, I think it is really interesting. I mean, to be honest, I think you've preached on this recently, but I'm not sure that I have. I think you thought you might have preached on it last year.
I think I might have done. Yeah, I have a sort of sense of it. I don't know what the circumstances were. What I do remember noticing and thinking is that the lectionary, it seems to me, misses out. It should have had verse 40.
That's what I was going to say immediately. Yes.
Is it? Yeah, because I think there's an inclusio, quite obviously, a sandwich kind of construction with verse with a verse at the end about Jesus, growing in wisdom and in years, and that's so. In a sense, it seems like it's very clear that Luke intends us to think that this is what the story is about.
Yes, it is.
Which is actually quite an important issue here, isn't it? Because this is a classic passage that can be used and abused, and diversions can be easily followed, whereby there's a lot of speculation, often from our own cultural context, and not understanding the cultural context of Jesus, about parents who leave children behind and things like that.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes.
And it's a bit of a, so one does need to be quite clear about what is normative for first century Palestine. So I just think it. But I think
you say first century Palestine, but we probably ought to say first century Israel or first century Judea.
We should, yes, we should actually. Yes,
the name Syria Palestina was only given to the region by the Romans in the second century.
Second century, yeah. So first century Israel, and the inclusio, this is about Jesus growing in wisdom and stature, is actually a really, really helpful key, I think, that Luke.
Well, can I add two more things to that? Because you're right in saying you've got the inclusio of this passage. So verse 40 to verse 52, they demarcate this particular episode. Second thing, though, is to notice that the verse 40 also functions as a parallel back to the similar but less developed statement about John the Baptist.
Yes.
Because he also grows. I haven't got the text in front of me.
No, but he does. And
this is the danger of improvising. I should have had the text right there. But also,
it's verse 80 of chapter 1. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what is
the end of the Benedictus? The child grew and became strong in spirit.
Okay, right. So here's the really interesting contrast. The child grew and became strong in spirit. And then the verse about Jesus, the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Now, what's happening there is that we've both got the establishment of the parallel between Jesus and John, as we've seen before, but also, as we've seen before, a parallel, but in Jesus' case, it's always more developed.
Yes.
So John is the prophet of the Most High. Jesus is the Son of the Most High. Here you've got John grows in wisdom and strength of spirit. But here it says explicitly, and the favor of God was upon him. And that, for me, leads into the third point, which is that this phrase has a double focus. On the one hand, natural development. On the other hand, spiritual identity. As the presence of God amongst his people. And I think that's a theme that we see coming through in this narrative.
The other interesting aspect to this is that John the Baptist grows in the wilderness. He was in the wilderness until the day he appeared publicly to Israel. Jesus goes into the wilderness following his public appearance in Israel, in baptism. So he's very much pictured as at home with Mary and Joseph until that point.
So you get this double thing of human nurture and divine nurture.
Yeah.
How you do? So let's get into the passage proper. There's a lot there in that first verse, isn't there? Verse 40.
Yes.
I think the other thing that I mean, this is such an interesting passage. And of course, we noticed this already moving from Mark to Luke, which is in Luke, we do get this real finesse in terms of the narrative structure and shape. I mentioned to you actually previously, didn't I, that I was doing I use Daily Dose of Greek. It's just a nice way, just each day you get an email, and it means that you have the discipline of just pausing and spending a couple of minutes looking in detail at the grammar of one verse, and it's just nice to feed that in. And the verse today had a historic present in it, and I suddenly thought, well, that's interesting, isn't it? How is historic present used in the Gospels? Now, high risk strategy. I asked ChatGPT, and I said, ChatGPT, please tell me what percentage of verbs in the narrative of each Gospel uses historic present and why? And I got a really nice little analysis of it. Mark uses it as part of this sort of constant urgency. Matthew uses it a little bit less, but uses it at certain key moments in the narrative. John uses it as well, but John uses it in its primarily in its theological statements, and it drew on some key textbooks. Now, I wouldn't want to trust that. I wouldn't use it in teaching, for example, until I'd actually checked the stats myself another way or looked at the books myself. But it was quite a good way into it. But here's the thing: Luke's gospel, only 1%. Mark is 20% historic presence. Luke is only 1% historic presence. Why? It's what ChatGPT had scraped from the internet. Remember that all AI is doing is a clever scrape from the internet. So, the results are as good as the sources. But it commented that because Luke uses a really refined historiographical style of writing and therefore eschews historic presence.
Yes.
Which is exactly what we find here. Actually
Yes.
it's really carefully structured, and we'll come on to see some of the ways. Well, that's one example, that inclusio.
Yes, it's a classic example. And I think there's a very interesting example in the middle of the passage, which we'll also come to at the sort of climax point. So, but it does pose, it's an interesting passage, isn't it? Because it does pose questions. I mean, is this, is Luke telling us this is typical of Jesus' childhood? Is it a typical incident? Or is it actually untypical and therefore worthy of comment because it's the only one he tells?
I've got a view on that. Do you?
Yeah. I have a view on that too, but
the same view.
But there's also, there's also questions about, about Mary and Mary's response as well. I mean, is it astonishing or understandable that Mary is flustered and anxious despite knowing what she's been told about Jesus already? Yes. What's going on? What's going on there?
That's really interesting. As an ex-Roman Catholic, I think that's particularly interesting for me. Okay, so 41. This opens up exactly those questions, doesn't it? Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year
for the festival of the Passover,
at the feast of the Passover. So there's an interesting temporal marker. Now we've noticed before that actually Luke is quite interested in time and noting times and noting when things happen, and so we've seen that quite a lot already. They go every year. Presumably Jesus goes with them. Here we've got a depiction once again of Mary and Joseph as pious, Torah observant Jews. Jesus is raised in a pious Jewish household.
We have, and I mean, and that is simple obedience to the law. Exodus and Deuteronomy. That's what you do.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that they are pious, and that piety does extend to Galilee. According to John chapter 4, there were Galileans who went up to the festival. Do you remember that? As in 45.
Yeah.
So we know that
Gentiles,
Jews around the Galilee area. They travelled that distance to Jerusalem, and obviously Jews couldn't make it from. There must be a limit to how far Jews were prepared to go to the temple for an annual festival.
And here's another little insight into first century practice, which is that I have ordered a book, which is going to come tomorrow, so I can't wave it in front of you, by a scholar who studied papyri to look at everyday life.
Right.
And Peter Williams of Tyndale House posted on it on X, Twitter as it was, and just posted a couple of things. And some of the really interesting chapters in this book, one of which was Jews in the first century walked a lot.
Yeah.
And they walked to go to festivals, but they also walked and traveled to go and see people, and they're celebrating things with friends and relatives and so on. So they did get up and they walked around a lot in order to, all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to reading that when I get it.
That'd be fascinating. Yeah.
Is it time to see whether we agree or disagree about whether this was, a regular thing? Because my reading of this language here is they do it every year, and now he's recounting one particular example when Jesus was 12 years old. So I think he's saying that he did it all the time. Is that? Did you?
I do agree with that.
Okay.
I think,
but that's what the text seems to say. He's emphasizing this was their custom.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But I do think also that there is a strong sense in which, in terms of Mary's response, what we're getting here through chapter 2 is an increasing level of amazement, wondering, anxiety about Jesus. And I think we've mentioned before that Mary's presentation in the Gospels is not, is not all that flattering. It's not all that flattering, and this is the last time she's named in the Gospel. So she's mentioned as his mother in Luke 8, but this is the last time she's actually named.
Oh, right, okay, that's interesting, because this is also the first time Jesus speaks.
And also the first time Jesus speaks. So, but if you look at verse, if you remember back to verse 19 of chapter 2, she pondered,
all these things in her heart.
Ponders all these things in her heart after the angels, the shepherds come. That's fine. The word kind of means preserved, pondered. In verse 33, in the Simeon and Anna incident, she's astonished and amazed, and a sword will pierce her heart.
Yes.
And here we have anxiety, amazement, and a failure to understand. So there's a kind of trajectory there, which I think Luke is taking us on.
That's interesting, because good old Michael Parsons here, on the previous page of this passage, he lists Raymond Brown's list of 8 different possibilities for understanding the way the sword has pierced her heart. And part of it is the anxiety she feels when she realizes that actually Jesus sees the fatherhood of God as more important than his human parents.
Yeah. Which, of course,
interesting.
Luke then comments. I mean, Luke essentially in Luke 8, doesn't he? He actually relays that. I think it's 8:19 to onwards, isn't it? Something like something like that. You know, he's reconstituting what family means.
Yes, and the parallel passage is Matthew 12 verse.
So you see the first kind of
my brothers and sisters. You know
exactly. So you see the first hints of that here in the 12-year-old Jesus. He's already beginning to grasp that. And
can I also note that a depiction of Jesus as part of a family who regularly went to the pilgrim festivals ties in precisely with what we read in the 4th Gospel, which sees Jesus repeatedly in Jerusalem in the festivals, and which means that Luke is supporting the fact that actually John's overall narrative is more historically accurate than the synoptics, where they create this artifice that the only time Jesus is in Jerusalem is in the final week, which of course he isn't.
Yes,
he's been there all the time. He's been there 3 times a year for 3 years at least.
Yeah, because he's a Torah observant Jew, as we so frequently say.
Now, the feast was ended. Do you think it's any significance in him being 12 years old? I don't think so. I don't find anyone saying that's particularly significant.
No. People mention bar mitzvahs, but of course they didn't happen until centuries later, and actually the age for that is 13. So I don't think it's of any significance now.
But here was a really interesting comment I saw last week, attached actually to our previous video, about here's some historical realism.
Yeah,
because this person observed that in the 1st century, as is the case in Middle Eastern culture today, when a boy is 12 years old, they're on this cusp of transition from childhood to adulthood. And that in those cultures, women stayed together and men stayed together.
Yeah.
And that for a boy, in the transition from childhood to adulthood, that would be the transition from being with the women as a child to being with the men as an adult.
That's really interesting, isn't it?
So at the age of 12 is precisely the age where Mary would have assumed, well, he's a man now, he's with Joseph.
Yeah.
Joseph would assume, well, he's still a boy, he's with Mary. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting. It really is.
I think whoever made that comment, I can't remember who it was.
No, and then of course you see Jesus with the male teachers of the law in the temple. So which is,
so it's as if he's making that transition. So,
but it's important to say, isn't it, that going up as a large group of people to the festival is not at all unusual.
No.
He's a 12-year-old boy. He can't be expected to be with either parent all the time.
No.
Their culture is completely different. So like, I mean, even in our own culture, if you were in a large group with your parents,
my parents-in-law went to the Festival of Light in London in the 1970s, and my wife Maggie went with them. They had no idea where she was because they were with Christians, and they felt she was safe in the crowd.
Yeah.
There you have it.
Yeah,
she would have been about 12 actually.
Yeah. But it's important for us to say, and this is one of these things where our culture gets confused with the culture of the 1st century, is that this is not Luke telling us that Mary and Joseph were careless, they were bad parents, or anything of that sort. It's just
perfectly comprehensible.
Perfectly comprehensible. Yeah.
They began to search for him amongst relatives and acquaintances. Oh, by the way, once again, here's the counter to that Christmas narrative. Mary and Joseph in a stable on their own, lonely, blah, blah, blah. No, this is communitarian culture. Of course, you do things with your friends and relatives all the time. You're always in a crowd.
Yeah.
When they didn't find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. After 3 days, symbolic significance? I don't know.
No.
Maybe it was just a time. They found him sitting in the temple, sitting amongst the teachers. Now, here's our interesting compositional fact. This pericope has 170 words in Greek.
Oh, right.
And the middle phrase in Greek is sitting amongst the teachers. That's interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting. It's so interesting, isn't it? It's so interesting.
Joel Green pointed that out. The reason that's interesting is because Joel Green, one of the things he does in his commentaries, he pays attention to numerical composition. And the 3 times, for instance, the word compassion comes in Luke, it always comes as the middle word of a pericope.
Yes, and I do think that's deliberate, actually, because one of the commentators I read, I think it's David Gooding read in it, that he points out that Luke delays the climax of the scene or he delays what we hear from Mary, her sort of pent up distress, in the way he tells those two verses. So he could have said and it might have been obvious to say, when they found him, Mary said,
Yeah.
he doesn't tell us that first. And what he does tell us is the thing that's most important, which is, as you say, Jesus sitting at the feet of the teachers. And interestingly, listening and asking questions. He's not yet at the stage where
He's
teaching, because he's still, as you were saying earlier, growing.
He's growing, and he's
being nurtured.
Yeah.
Spiritually through the normal practices of Torah observance.
Yes.
Sitting at the feet of the.
But also in cultural context as well. You know, the natural way that you do things is you have a discussion, you ask a question, you listen to the answer, you offer your own view, you come back, you have this sort of dialogical thing. It's not a sort of one-way transition.
Not one-way transition. No.
And of course, one of the ways that Jesus teaches in the Gospels is he asks people questions.
Yes.
You know, who do you seek? Who do you say that I am?
Yeah.
What do you want me to do for you?
Yeah.
So,
and they're amazed at his answers, and of course, but you also gain an enormous amount, don't you, from understanding people's understanding by the questions they ask.
Yes.
The intelligent question is a huge indicator of the way in which people are engaged with something.
No, it really is actually. If you're ever teaching a class in situation, you can tell how people are engaging by the questions they ask you.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. Yeah. An interesting contrast, isn't it? The positive amazement of the teachers on the one hand, and the negative astonishment of Mary and presumably and Joseph. But there's something interesting here about language as well, because so when his parents saw him, so that's a sort of generic term, but then she says, well, it's translated his son. It's actually the word child, son, male's technon. Child. It's really child.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, isn't it? That in this thing about the transition from childhood to adulthood. So Mary
child.
As child. And although it's mentioned his parents, his answer is only in terms of father.
Yes.
So again, it's just indicative of this transition. And it's almost as if in the transition from childhood to adulthood, Jesus is also making the transition from obedience to parents and learning from them on the one hand to his heavenly Father on the other. So
I do think that's very significant. And this phrase, this is interesting. Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? House is not there in the Greek. It's in
that of my Father.
It's just in my Father's.
In the of my Father.
Exactly. But that idea of him expressing it in that way is pretty much unheard of in terms of an individual in the Old Testament, isn't it?
Just looking at different translations, by the way. Modern translations, ESV, TNIV say "in my Father's house," but the King James actually says, the Authorized Version says, "about my Father's business." So that actually reflects the ambiguity there.
Yes, because it doesn't actually refer to place directly. I mean, it could be that, or it could be as it says, in
the things. Do you not know how to
in the things
of my Father? Really interesting thing about learning. One of the things that Michael Parsons points out is that, again, just looking at Luke as an example of first century historiography, if you are telling the story of someone's life, a bios, that's in Richard Burridge's language, Four Gospels on Jesus, you would always have an episode or something about their nurture, because them having been raised well and educated well was really important to demonstrate good foundation for their life. So it's not surprising if Luke is wanting to tick those historiographical boxes. That's why he made sure he included this episode, which he probably learnt of from Mary. In fact,
I think that's important as well. That Mary tells this story against herself.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, which gives it an authenticity, actually, if she is his source. Yeah.
As in Mark's Gospel, Peter tells against himself.
Exactly. Exactly.
But the interesting thing Michael Parsons says is that in Greek and Roman education, to be compelled to do something was the worst thing, because you should be showing yourself as you're decisive. You don't do things because you have to. And this is where we get this intersection between Greek and Roman historiography on the one hand and the canonical trajectory of the Jewish scriptures on the other, because it says Dei, I must be about my Father's business, which is, of course, an allusion to saying in the Old Testament that language is always about the sovereignty of God. If something must be done, that's a way of it's a periphrastic way of saying this is God's will.
Yes.
So what he's saying is, well, you wanted me this, you're anxious about this. Actually, my priority now is doing what God demands. So although it doesn't meet the Greco-Roman historiographical thing, tick that box, it does tick the box of Jesus saying, actually, I'm now submitting to the word of God.
Interesting.
And they did not understand what he was saying, that he spoke to them. That's fascinating, isn't it? Again, it doesn't depict Mary particularly
in a good light. No.
And he went down with them and came to Nazareth. Well, Nazareth is in the hills, but of course they're coming down from the hill country of Judea. So again, this is an accurate topographical reference. And just as in the old days, people said going down from Oxford or Cambridge or going down from London, again from Jerusalem, everywhere from Jerusalem is down.
It's down. Yeah. We talked about that before, haven't we?
Yeah.
And then actually, and was obedient to them is actually in the narrative is a surprise, isn't it? Because you think, okay, he's asserting himself here and his new loyalty or his loyalty to the Father.
I'm actually interested that you say obedient to them, because it doesn't actually say obedient.
No, that's the new RSV.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Shock horror.
Yeah.
It's really important not to say that, because that's the verb hupakuo. The verb is actually hupotasso.
It's obedience in NIV as well, 2011, but it's submissive to them in ESV.
Yeah.
Interesting. That is interesting, isn't it?
Well, there is a difference between obedience and submission, because we're exhorted to be submissive to one another.
Yes. To be subject to another is quite a different thing, isn't it?
It's got a sense of ordering, so natural.
Yes.
Again, you see, it revisits this dynamic, doesn't it? Of the one hand, Jesus is obedient to the Father, his heavenly Father. On the other hand, he actually continues to grow in the pattern of a human family.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And then you get this amazing phrase. Now, you alluded to this before. His mother treasured up all these things in her heart. Isn't that interesting?
Yes. Slightly different. It's a different word from pondered in verse 19 with the angels, but it's of the same from tereo.
Tereo. Yeah. To keep hold of.
Exactly. Yeah. So she holds them all.
I don't know if the commentators make any connection, because of course keep is what you do with the scriptures, the law as well, the commands of God.
That's interesting.
She kept them all she stored them up as a treasury in her heart. Again, one of the other things I've had, maybe from Mike Thompson, that we mentioned last time, where did Luke get all these early material from? In the non-we bits between Acts 16 and Acts 20, did he then go to Ephesus, where Mary was according to tradition, and this is when he interviewed her and other eyewitnesses there. So the treasury there that she stored up, that's when Luke opens the treasury and, takes the treasures out and unlocks them. So there we go. And then finally, we get the end of the inclusio. Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Oh, we've got the dynamic brought out really explicitly there, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
it's perfect. Once again, it's absolutely, Luke is telling us what this is about.
Yes, it's about both and one and the other. It's not. And of course, on the one hand, doesn't that reflect the dynamic of the incarnation and the stuff we hear in John 1, that the Word, before
flesh.
God was becomes flesh, so fully human. I think there's quite an interesting little connection here with Paul and Christian leadership as well. And I've always been struck by the fact that in the pastorals, when he talks about Christian leadership, he says, yes, they need to be people who are wise and read the scriptures and, but they also need to be people who are well respected outside.
Yeah.
In favor with God and people as well.
Yes.
Sorry, I used the non-inclusive version. In favor with God and anthropoi, people.
Yes.
Not male men, but people.
No, people. Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot there.
There is.
In a nutshell, because we've only got 1 minute, what would you do about preaching on this?
Oh, right. That's a good question. I think I would go for that. I think I would go for the issue about Jesus being both human and divine.
Yeah.
I think there's huge misunderstanding and about this in the church, that on both sides. So some emphasize Jesus basically only human. Others emphasize he's divine. He must know everything. Actually, this story nails that, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
I love the fact as well that commentators say, well, on the one hand, the climax of the story is this contrast where Jesus rebukes his mother and says, do you not know I need to be in my Father's house, about my Father's business, doing the things of my Father on the one hand. And that seems to be the sort of turning point. And yet, located in the middle words of the pericope are, he is sitting amongst the teachers. And of course, Jesus' ministry becomes the one who is the great teacher.
Yes. And I think Luke has structured that quite deliberately.
Yes.
Yeah.
James, thank you so much. What fun.
Yeah.
How great after Christmas to get back into the scriptures.
Yeah.
Friends, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to do those things. Do make a comment below. Do give us a thumbs up on the video. That's really great because other people can find it. Do subscribe button. And James, share it on your
socials.
Absolutely. And we will see you in the new year.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, James. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.